This is HOA catastrophe. Do not blink. She was standing in my driveway with her phone held inches from my face, snapping photos of my RV like I had committed a felony. Read the standards, she said. That is how it works. I stepped back and asked her to move so I could get to work, but Teresa Evans just smiled and kept photographing every angle of my rig. This is a violation, she announced. You have until tonight to remove it, or the board will fine you and schedule a tow. I moved to Juniper Reserve Community HOA in Atlanta, Georgia, because I wanted something low maintenance, and I believed an HOA meant fewer problems. I work in cybersecurity, and I cannot miss work. The neighborhood is a gated HOA where committees patrol for parking violations, and the board brags about compliance. I bought the house 6 months ago, and everything was fine until last week when I parked my RV in my own driveway for 3 days while I prepped it for a camping trip. Teresa Evans is a board member who runs the portal and brags about citations. The violation notice claimed I broke overnight parking rules, even though my RV was temporary, and I had every right to park it there. The stakes were my peace of mind and sleep, and Teresa was about to make both disappear. The notice had arrived in my mailbox that morning. It was printed on Juniper Reserve letterhead with a violation code, a description claiming I violated community standards, and a hearing date already set for tonight at 7. I read it twice in my kitchen, while my coffee went cold. The document said my RV was parked overnight in violation of Section 12.4 of the Community Standards, and that I was required to appear at the board hearing tonight to explain myself. If I failed to appear, the board would proceed with fines and potential towing. The hearing was in 9 hours. I pulled out my HOA binder and flipped to Section 12.4. The rules said recreational vehicles and boats on trailers could not be parked in driveways or visible from the street for more than 72 consecutive hours without written board approval. I had parked my RV on a Wednesday afternoon, and it was now Saturday morning. That was less than 72 hours. I was still within the window. I grabbed my phone and took a photo of the page, then checked my driveway security camera footage. The timestamp showed I had pulled the RV in at 4:15 on Wednesday, and Teresa had left the notice this morning at 8. 67 hours. Not a violation. I called the management company and got voicemail. I left a message explaining the timeline and asking them to contact Teresa before the hearing. Then I texted my neighbor Ben, who lived 2 doors down and had been complaining about Teresa for months. He responded in under a minute. She is targeting you, man. She did the same thing to the guy on Maple last year. He had a boat and she made his life hell until he moved. I felt my stomach tighten. Ben offered to write a statement backing me up if I needed it. I thanked him and said I would let him know. Teresa showed up at my house again that afternoon while I was loading gear into the RV. I heard her voice before I saw her. You are still in violation, she called out from the sidewalk. I turned around and she was marching up my driveway in her blaze orange jacket, clipboard in one hand and phone in the other. I told her I was within the 72-hour window, and she shook her head like I was a child who did not understand basic math. Read the standards, she said again. That is how it works. The board interprets overnight as any period that includes 2 midnights. You parked it Wednesday afternoon, so Wednesday night was 1 midnight. Thursday night was 2 midnights. You violated on Friday morning. I stared at her. That interpretation was nowhere in the written rule. I told her the standards did not define overnight that way, and she cut me off. We already voted, she said. It is already documented. The hearing tonight is just a formality, so you can state your case, but the decision is made. You need to move the RV by tomorrow morning or we will proceed with enforcement. I asked her how they could vote before hearing my side and she smiled. The board reviewed the evidence and determined a violation occurred. You will have your chance to speak tonight. Then she turned and walked back down my driveway, snapping more photos of the RV as she went. I went inside and pulled the community standards document again. I searched for any mention of how overnight was defined. Nothing. The rule just said 72 consecutive hours. I took screenshots of the relevant pages and emailed them to myself with timestamps. Then I went back through my driveway camera footage and clipped the segment showing the RV arriving on Wednesday at 4:15. I saved it to a thumb drive. I also checked the other driveways on my street using the neighborhood Facebook photos from the past 2 months. I found 3 separate instances where other residents had RVs or boats parked for longer than 72 hours with no citations. One was a boat on a trailer that sat in a driveway on Maple for 11 days in April. No violation notice. I took screenshots of those posts with the dates visible. The management company called me back at 5. The property manager, a woman named Linda, sounded tired. She said she had received my message and reviewed the file. According to her records, Teresa had submitted a violation report on Friday morning claiming the RV had been parked since Tuesday night. I interrupted and told her that was not true. I had camera footage proving I parked it Wednesday afternoon. Linda paused. She said she would look into it, but the hearing was already scheduled and the board had the authority to interpret the rules. I asked her if the board was allowed to vote before the hearing and she went quiet for a moment. Then she said she would recommend they table the vote until after hearing my statement. That was all she could do. I printed everything. The camera screenshots with timestamps, the standards excerpt, the Facebook photo showing selective enforcement, the email chain with Linda. I put it all in a folder and tried to eat dinner, but I had no appetite. My phone buzzed at 6:30. It was an email from Teresa with the subject line, "Reminder, hearing tonight." The body of the email said the board would convene at 7 in the clubhouse, and I was expected to attend. Failure to attend would result in automatic escalation to fines and a tow authorization. At the bottom, she had copied an attorney named Richard Calloway. I read the email 3 times. She was already escalating to attorney-copied emails. I drove to the clubhouse at 6:50. The parking lot was nearly empty. I grabbed my folder and walked inside. The board was sitting at a long table in the conference room. Teresa was in the center with 2 other board members I recognized from the annual meeting last year. One was an older man named Greg who ran the landscaping committee. The other was a woman in her 50s named Paula who handled the budget. Linda, the property manager, sat off to the side with a laptop open. Teresa looked up when I walked in and smiled. "Thank you for coming," she said in a voice that sounded almost friendly. "Please have a seat." I sat down across from them and set my folder on the table. Greg cleared his throat and said the board had reviewed my violation and determined that my RV had been parked in violation of Section 12.4. He said I would have 5 minutes to state my case, and then the board would make a final decision. I opened my folder and started with the timeline. I explained that I had parked the RV on Wednesday at 4:15, not Tuesday night, and I had camera footage proving it. Teresa interrupted. "The notice was based on a neighbor complaint," she said. "We have documentation that the RV was visible from the street on Wednesday morning." I stopped her. I said the RV was not even in my driveway Wednesday morning. It was still parked at the storage facility. I pulled out the printed screenshot from my security camera showing the empty driveway Wednesday at 8 in the morning, and then the second screenshot showing the RV pulling in at 4:15 that afternoon. I slid both across the table. Greg picked them up and looked at them, then passed them to Paula. Teresa's smile faded. She said the board had already determined a violation based on the evidence available at the time. I asked her what evidence, and she said a photo submitted by a neighbor showing the RV in my driveway on Wednesday night. I asked to see the photo. Linda spoke up. She said she had not seen any neighbor photo in the file. Teresa shot her a look. She said the photo was submitted verbally during a phone call, and the board accepted it as credible. I could feel my pulse climbing. I told them that was not evidence. A verbal report was not the same as a time-stamped photo. I pulled out my phone and showed them the camera footage on the screen. Wednesday, 4:15 in the afternoon. That was when the RV arrived. Teresa leaned forward. She said the board interprets overnight parking as any period that includes 2 midnights, so even if I parked it Wednesday afternoon, it violated on Friday morning. I asked her to show me where that interpretation was written in the standards. She did not answer. Greg said the board had the authority to interpret rules as needed to maintain community standards. I pulled out the next set of screenshots, the Facebook photos showing other RVs and boats parked longer than 72 hours with no violations. I slid them across the table. I said if the board was going to enforce this rule, it needed to enforce it equally. One of the photos showed a boat on Maple Street parked for 11 days in April, no citation. Another showed an RV on Oak parked for a week in May. no citation. Why was I being singled out? Teresa picked up the photos and barely glanced at them. She said those situations were different because the owners had received verbal approval from the board. I asked for documentation of that approval. She said it was handled informally and not all approvals were recorded. I could feel my hands shaking. I told them that was selective enforcement and it was not legal. Paula, the budget committee woman, looked uncomfortable. She asked Linda if there was any record of verbal approvals. Linda shook her head. She said all approvals were supposed to be submitted in writing and logged in the portal. If there was no record, there was no approval. Teresa's face went red. She said the board had discretion to handle approvals on a case-by-case basis, and the lack of documentation did not invalidate the process. I asked her if she had any proof that those owners received approval. She did not answer. Instead, she said the board had already voted to uphold the violation, and my hearing time was over. I looked at Greg and Paula. I said I was told this hearing was supposed to happen before the vote, not after. Greg shifted in his seat. He said the board had held a preliminary vote based on the initial evidence, but they were willing to hear my statement before finalizing. I asked what the point of a hearing was if they had already decided. Linda closed her laptop. She said the board should table the vote until the discrepancies in the timeline were resolved. Teresa turned on her. She said the property manager did not have authority to override the board. Linda did not back down. She said the management company was contracted to ensure the HOA followed its own governing documents, and voting before a scheduled hearing violated procedural standards. If the board proceeded with enforcement without resolving the timeline issue, the management company would not process the violation. Teresa stood up. She said the board would reconvene on Monday to finalize the decision, and in the meantime, I was required to remove the RV by tomorrow morning. I did not move it. I left the RV exactly where it was. Sunday morning, I woke up to another email from Teresa. The subject line said, "Final notice, compliance required." The body of the email said the board had reviewed my case and determined the violation stood. I was required to remove the RV by 5 that afternoon, or the board would authorize a tow and assess fines retroactive to Friday. She had copied the same attorney, Richard Calloway, and added a second recipient, a towing company called Metro Tow and Recovery. I felt my chest tighten. She was escalating to a pre-lien notice. I forwarded the email to Linda and asked if the board had actually reconvened. She responded an hour later. She said there had been no board meeting on Sunday and no vote. Teresa had sent the email on her own authority. Linda said she had contacted the board president, who was Greg, and he confirmed that no meeting had taken place. She recommended I document everything and consider filing a complaint with the board. I asked her what good a complaint would do if Teresa controlled the portal and the process. She did not have an answer. Ben texted me that afternoon. He said Teresa had been going door to door on our street, asking neighbors if they had seen my RV parked earlier in the week. One neighbor told her they had not noticed it until Thursday. Another said they did not pay attention to my driveway. Ben said Teresa was trying to build a case after the fact. He offered again to write a statement, and this time I said yes. He sent me a signed letter within an hour. It said he had lived 2 doors down from me for 4 years. He had a clear view of my driveway, and he had not seen the RV parked there until Wednesday evening. He included the date and his contact information. I printed the letter and added it to my folder. Then I went through my phone and found the text exchange I had with the storage facility manager on Wednesday morning. I had texted him at 10 to confirm the RV would be ready for pickup that afternoon. He had replied at 11 saying it was good to go and I could pick it up any time after 3. I took screenshots of the text with the timestamps visible. That was more proof the RV had not been in my driveway Wednesday morning. I also pulled my credit card statement showing the storage facility charge dated Wednesday. I was building a timeline that Teresa could not argue with. Monday morning, I got another email from Teresa. This one had the subject line, "Pre-lien notice. Immediate action required." It said the board had determined I was in willful violation of community standards and had authorized the assessment of fines totaling $500, plus an additional $100 per day until compliance. If the fines were not paid within 10 days, the board would file a lien against my property. The email was copied to Richard Calloway, Metro Tow and Recovery, and now a third recipient, a collections agency called Southeastern Account Services. I read the email twice and felt my hands go numb. She was trying to destroy me over a parking dispute. I called Linda immediately. She said she had just seen the email and she was appalled. There had been no board meeting, no vote, and no authorization for fines. Teresa had sent the email without board approval. Linda said she was going to contact the board president and recommend an emergency meeting to address Teresa's conduct. I asked her how long that would take, and she said at least a few days. I did not have a few days. The hearing is tonight, Teresa had said. The tow company was already copied. I needed to act faster. I pulled up the HOA governing documents and searched for the section on board member conduct. It said board members were required to act in good faith, follow established procedures, and avoid conflicts of interest. It also said any board member who violated the governing documents could be removed by a majority vote of the homeowners. I took a screenshot of that section. Then I drafted an email to the entire board, not just Teresa. I attached all my evidence, the camera footage timestamps, the text messages with the storage facility, Ben's signed letter, the Facebook photos showing selective enforcement, and Linda's email confirming there had been no board meetings. I explained the timeline in detail and pointed out that Teresa had sent multiple emails without board authorization. I said I was requesting an emergency meeting to address the procedural violations, and I was prepared to file a formal complaint if necessary. I hit send at noon. Within an hour, I got replies from Greg and Paula. Greg said he had not been aware of the pre-lien notice, and he agreed an emergency meeting was needed. Paula said she was concerned about the lack of documentation, and she wanted Linda to present a full report. Teresa did not reply. Instead, she showed up at my house again that afternoon. I was in the garage when I heard her voice. "You think you can go around me?" she said. I walked outside and she was standing on my driveway with her phone out, filming me. I asked her what she was doing, and she said she was documenting my harassment and intimidation of the board. I told her I had sent a factual email with evidence, and that was not harassment. She stepped closer. "You are trying to undermine my authority," she said. "Read the standards. That is how it works." I could feel the anger rising in my chest, but I kept my voice calm. I told her she had no authority to send pre-lien notices without board approval, and I had documentation proving she had acted alone. She smiled. "We already voted," she said. "It is already documented." I recognized the line. She had said the exact same thing on Saturday, when she told me the hearing was a formality. I asked her when the vote happened, and she said it was none of my business. Then she turned and walked back to her car, still filming me over her shoulder. I went inside and immediately emailed Linda with a description of what had just happened. She replied in minutes. She said Teresa's behavior was unacceptable, and she was recommending the board suspend Teresa's portal access pending an investigation. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday night. I spent Tuesday preparing. I printed every piece of evidence again and organized it into a binder with tabs. Camera footage, text messages, emails, Ben's letter, Facebook photos, Linda's correspondence, and the pre-lien notice Teresa had sent without authorization. I also pulled the community standards section on board member conduct and highlighted the relevant passages. I was ready to show what really happened. That night I got a text from Ben. He said Teresa had been by his house earlier asking him to retract his statement. She told him I had manipulated the facts and he was supporting a liar. He refused and she left angry. He said he was planning to attend the meeting Wednesday to back me up in person. Wednesday afternoon, I got an email from Greg. The subject line said, "Board meeting tonight. Agenda attached." The agenda listed 3 items: review of violation timeline, discussion of procedural concerns, and board member conduct review. Teresa was listed as a respondent. I felt a small flicker of hope. At least the board was taking it seriously. The meeting was set for 7 at the clubhouse. I planned to arrive early. At 6:30 I got another email, this time from Teresa. The subject line said, "You will regret this." The body of the email was a single sentence: "I have evidence you will not want the board to see." No explanation. No attachment. Just a threat. I stared at the email for a long time. I had no idea what evidence she was talking about. I had followed every rule, documented everything, and told the truth. There was nothing she could have on me. I forwarded the email to Linda and asked if she had any idea what Teresa meant. Linda replied immediately. She said it sounded like a bluff and I should not engage. She recommended I bring the email to the meeting as further evidence of Teresa's intimidation tactics. I printed it and added it to my binder. I arrived at the clubhouse at 6:45. The parking lot was fuller than it had been on Saturday. I recognized a few cars from my street, including Ben's truck. Inside, the conference room was set up the same way. The board sat at the long table. Teresa was there, wearing her blaze orange jacket, arms crossed, staring straight ahead. Greg was at the center again with Paula beside him. Linda sat off to the side with her laptop. There were about a dozen homeowners and chairs along the wall, including Ben. He gave me a nod when I sat down. Greg called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. He said the board had received multiple complaints regarding the RV violation process, and the purpose of tonight's meeting was to review the facts and determine if procedural errors had occurred. Teresa spoke first. She said I had parked my RV in violation of community standards and refused to comply despite multiple notices. She said the board had voted to uphold the violation and assess fines, and I was now attempting to intimidate board members and undermine the enforcement process. She pulled out a printed copy of my email to the board and held it up. "This is harassment," she said. "He is attacking me personally because he does not want to follow the rules." Greg asked her to clarify when the board had voted. She hesitated. She said the vote had taken place during an executive session on Friday. Linda interrupted. She said there was no record of an executive session on Friday, and executive sessions were only allowed for specific legal or personnel matters. A violation hearing did not qualify. Teresa's face went red. She said the property manager did not have authority to question board decisions. Linda did not back down. She said the management company was responsible for ensuring compliance with governing documents, and an unrecorded executive session violated open meeting requirements. If Teresa claimed a vote had taken place, she needed to provide minutes. Teresa did not respond. Greg asked her directly if there were minutes from the executive session. She said the minutes were being finalized. Paula asked when they would be available. Teresa said soon. Greg said that was not acceptable. He asked Linda to check the portal for any record of a Friday meeting. Linda opened her laptop and searched. After a moment, she shook her head. No meeting scheduled. No minutes posted. No vote recorded. I could see Teresa's hands shaking. She said the vote had happened, and the board had the authority to handle violations as it saw fit. Greg cut her off. He said if there was no record of a vote, there was no vote. He asked me to present my evidence. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I opened my binder and started with the timeline. I showed the camera screenshots proving the RV had arrived Wednesday at 4:15, not Tuesday night. I showed the text messages with the storage facility confirming the pickup time. I showed Ben's signed letter. I showed the Facebook photos of other RVs and boats parked longer with no citations. I showed Linda's emails confirming no board meetings had taken place. I showed Teresa's pre-lien notice sent without board authorization. I showed her email threatening me earlier today. I laid it all out, piece by piece, on the table in front of the board. When I finished, Greg asked Teresa if she had any response. She said the evidence was manipulated and I had coached my neighbor. Ben stood up from the back of the room. He said no one had coached him, and he was happy to testify under oath if needed. Teresa turned and glared at him. She said he was biased because we were friends. Ben said he barely knew me, and he was just telling the truth. Another homeowner in the back raised her hand. She said she had seen Teresa going door to door over the weekend asking leading questions about my RV, and it seemed like she was trying to build a case after the fact. Greg asked the homeowner to submit a written statement. She agreed. Paula asked Linda if the management company had any recommendations. Linda said the violation should be dismissed due to lack of evidence and procedural errors. She also recommended the board investigate Teresa's conduct, including the unauthorized emails and the apparent retaliation. Teresa stood up. She said this was a witch hunt, and the board was caving to pressure from a resident who refused to follow the rules. Greg told her to sit down. She did not. She said she had served on the board for 6 years, and she had never been treated this way. She said if the board dismissed the violation, she would resign. Greg said that was her choice, but the board had an obligation to follow its own governing documents. I pulled out the last piece of evidence. It was an email from Linda that I had not shown yet. The email was dated Friday morning, the same day Teresa claimed the board had voted in executive session. In the email, Linda had written to Teresa asking for clarification on the violation timeline, because the initial report did not match the camera footage. Teresa had replied, and in her reply, she had admitted that the neighbor complaint was based on a misunderstanding, and the RV had likely been parked Wednesday afternoon, not Tuesday night. But she had added that the board could still interpret the rule to include any period spanning 2 midnights, so the violation stood regardless. I read the email out loud, word for word. Then I looked at Teresa. You admitted the timeline was wrong, I said. You admitted the complaint was a misunderstanding, but you proceeded with enforcement anyway. The room went silent. Teresa's face was pale. She said the email was taken out of context. I asked her what context made it acceptable to admit the facts were wrong and still pursue a violation. She did not answer. Greg asked Linda if the email was authentic. Linda nodded. She said she had the original in her records with full headers. Greg looked at Teresa. He said the board would vote tonight on whether to dismiss the violation and whether to suspend Teresa's board access pending a formal investigation. Teresa grabbed her clipboard and walked out of the room. The door slammed behind her. The board voted unanimously to dismiss the violation. Greg said the fines would be voided and no further action would be taken regarding my RV. He also said the board would schedule a special meeting to address Teresa's conduct and determine if removal proceedings were warranted. Paula said she was recommending the board adopt new policies requiring all violation notices to be reviewed by the property manager before being sent to residents. Linda said the management company supported that recommendation. I thanked them and sat down. Ben came over and shook my hand. A few other homeowners stopped to tell me they appreciated me standing up to Teresa. I felt the tension in my chest start to ease. I drove home and parked in my driveway. The RV was still there, exactly where it had been since Wednesday. I sat in my car for a few minutes, just breathing. My phone buzzed. It was an email from Greg. The subject line said, "Follow-up. Next steps." The body of the email said the board would meet next week to discuss Teresa's removal, and he wanted to thank me for bringing the procedural issues to their attention. He said the board took violations seriously, but it also took fairness seriously, and my case had highlighted problems that needed to be fixed. I appreciated the email, but I was exhausted. I went inside, made dinner, and tried to decompress. Thursday morning, I woke up to another email from Teresa. I almost did not open it. The subject line said, "This is not over." The body of the email said, the board had no authority to dismiss a valid violation, and she was filing a complaint with the county zoning office regarding my RV. She said the county had stricter rules than the HOA, and I would be facing fines from the government instead. She also said she was consulting with an attorney about filing a defamation lawsuit against me for damaging her reputation. I forwarded the email to Linda without comment. Linda replied within minutes. She said Teresa's behavior was escalating, and I should consider filing a restraining order. She also said the county zoning office would not take action based on a single complaint without an investigation, and Teresa had no grounds for a defamation claim. I did not file a restraining order, but I did contact an attorney. I found a lawyer in Atlanta who specialized in HOA disputes and real estate law. Her name was Michelle Torres. I sent her all my documentation and scheduled a consultation for Friday. She reviewed everything and told me I had a strong case if Teresa continued to harass me. She said the emails alone were enough to establish a pattern of retaliation, and if Teresa filed a defamation suit, it would be dismissed immediately. She also said I could file a counterclaim for emotional distress and abusive process. I asked her how much it would cost, and she said she could handle it on contingency if it went to court. I felt a little better knowing I had legal backup. Friday afternoon, I got a call from Greg. He said the board had held a special meeting and voted to remove Teresa from her position. She was no longer a board member and her portal access had been revoked. He said the board had also voted to send her a cease and desist letter prohibiting her from contacting me or any other homeowners regarding HOA matters. If she violated the cease and desist, the board would take legal action. I thanked him and asked if Teresa had been at the meeting. He said no. She had been invited to attend and given a chance to respond, but she had declined. The vote was unanimous. I thought that would be the end of it, but Teresa was not done. Saturday morning I was loading the RV to take it back to storage when she pulled up in front of my house. She got out of her car and walked onto my driveway. I told her she was not allowed to contact me and she needed to leave. She ignored me. She said the board had overstepped and she was going to file a lawsuit against the HOA for wrongful termination. She said she was also going to make sure every violation I had ever committed was documented and pursued. I pulled out my phone and started recording. She saw the camera and her expression changed. She said I was harassing her and she was going to call the police. I told her she was on my property and she needed to leave immediately. She stood there for another moment, then turned and walked back to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, staring at my house, before finally driving away. I sent the video to Michelle Torres. She said it was perfect evidence of continued harassment and she was drafting a formal demand letter on my behalf. She said if Teresa contacted me again, we would file for a restraining order and pursue damages. I also sent the video to Greg and Linda. Greg said the board would add it to the file and proceed with enforcement of the cease and desist. Linda said the management company was terminating its relationship with Teresa and she would no longer receive any HOA correspondence. I felt a small sense of relief, but I was still on edge. Teresa had shown she was willing to escalate no matter what the consequences were. The following week was quiet. I took the RV back to storage and focused on work. I checked my email obsessively, expecting another threat from Teresa, but nothing came. Ben texted me to say he had heard Teresa was telling people in the neighborhood that I had orchestrated a conspiracy to remove her from the board. He said no one was buying it. Most people were relieved she was gone. A few homeowners reached out to thank me for standing up to her. One woman said Teresa had targeted her last year over a mailbox color and made her life miserable for months. She said she wished she had fought back the way I did. On Thursday, I got a call from Linda. She said the board had received a letter from Teresa's attorney threatening legal action. The letter claimed the board had violated Teresa's due process rights by removing her without a proper hearing. It demanded reinstatement and compensation for reputational harm. Linda said the board's attorney had reviewed the letter and determined it had no merit. The board had followed all procedures and Teresa had been given multiple opportunities to respond. The attorney was drafting a reply and the board was not backing down. I asked Linda if I needed to do anything and she said no. The board was handling it. 2 weeks later, the board held its annual meeting. It was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the clubhouse. I was not planning to attend, but Ben convinced me to go. He said the board was going to present an update on the Teresa situation, and it would be good for people to see me there. I agreed. The meeting started at 2. The room was packed. I recognized most of the faces from the neighborhood. Greg opened with a summary of the year's budget and maintenance projects, then moved to the board member update. He said Teresa Evans had been removed from the board in March due to procedural violations and abuse of authority. He said the board took resident concerns seriously and was committed to fair and transparent enforcement. A few people clapped. One homeowner raised his hand and asked if Teresa was still living in the neighborhood. Greg said yes, but she was no longer involved in HOA operations. Then, Greg said the board wanted to recognize a homeowner who had brought important procedural issues to their attention. He did not say my name, but he looked at me. He said the situation had led to policy changes that would benefit the entire community, including a new requirement that all violation notices be reviewed by the property manager before being sent. He said the board appreciated residents who held them accountable. A few more people clapped. I felt my face go red. I had not expected any kind of acknowledgement. After the meeting, several homeowners came up to talk to me. One man said he had been dealing with a similar issue, and my case had given him the courage to push back. A woman said she had never trusted Teresa and she was glad the board had finally acted. I left the meeting feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Ben and I grabbed coffee at a shop near the neighborhood and talked about the whole ordeal. He said Teresa was a case study in what happened when someone with too much power and too little oversight decided to make someone's life hell. He said the neighborhood was better off without her. I agreed, but I also felt a little sad. The whole situation had been exhausting and unnecessary. If Teresa had just followed the rules and treated people fairly, none of it would have happened. But she had chosen to escalate, and it had cost her everything. A month later, I got an email from Michelle Torres. She said Teresa had dropped her defamation threat and her attorney had sent a letter withdrawing all claims. She said it looked like Teresa had realized she had no case and did not want to risk a counterclaim. Michelle said I was in the clear and she did not anticipate any further issues. I thanked her and paid her consultation fee. I felt a wave of relief. It was finally over. I could move on. I could park my RV in my driveway for a weekend without worrying about retaliation. I could check my mailbox without dreading another violation notice. I could sleep. The next few months were uneventful. I saw Teresa once at the grocery store. She was in the produce section and I was by the dairy. We made eye contact for a second, then she turned and walked away. I did not say anything. There was nothing left to say. The board continued its policy reforms. Linda told me they had implemented a new system where all violation notices required dual approval from the property manager and the board president. She said the number of complaints had dropped significantly. A few homeowners had reached out to her to report past incidents of selective enforcement, and the board was reviewing those cases. It felt like the neighborhood was healing. In June, I took my RV on a camping trip to the mountains. I parked it in my driveway for 2 days before the trip to load gear and prep the engine. No one said a word. No violation notice, no photos, no threats. Just a normal neighborhood where people minded their own business. It was exactly what I had wanted when I moved to Juniper Reserve. I realized the HOA could work the way it was supposed to work, as long as the people running it were fair and followed the rules. Teresa had been the problem, not the system. And now that she was gone, the system had a chance to function properly. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more real HOA conflicts and how people fight back. I kept all my documentation in a file on my computer. I did not need it anymore, but I did not delete it either. It was a reminder of what I had been through and how I had stood up for myself. It was also a reminder that evidence mattered. Facts mattered. Timestamps, receipts, emails, photos, they all mattered. Teresa had tried to rewrite the timeline and intimidate me into compliance, but the evidence had spoken for itself. I had shown what really happened, and the board had listened. That was the difference between losing and winning. Ben and I stayed in touch. We were not close friends, but we had a mutual respect. He had been the first person to warn me about Teresa, and he had backed me up when it mattered. A few months after the annual meeting, he told me he was thinking about running for the board. He said the neighborhood needed people who would enforce the rules fairly and treat residents with respect. I told him he had my vote. He laughed and said he hoped other people felt the same way. In the fall, he ran and won. He became the new board member in charge of compliance. One of his first actions was to create a public log of all violations, so residents could see how the rules were being enforced across the neighborhood. It was exactly the kind of transparency Teresa had fought against. I never heard from Teresa again after that day at the grocery store. I did not know if she was still living in the neighborhood or if she had moved. I did not care. She was no longer part of my life. The fight was over, and I had won. Not because I had destroyed her, but because I had defended myself and forced the system to work the way it was supposed to. That was enough. I had my peace of mind back. I had my sleep back. I had my home back. And I had learned that standing up to a bully, even when it was exhausting and scary, was worth it. The HOA continued to improve. Greg stepped down as board president the following year, and Paula took over. She was less reactive than Greg and more focused on long-term planning. She worked with Linda to overhaul the violation process and create clearer guidelines for enforcement. The new system required photo evidence for all violations, mandatory review periods before fines could be assessed, and an appeals process that actually gave residents a fair hearing. It was not perfect, But it was better. Much better. And it was a direct result of what had happened with Teresa and me. The board had learned that unchecked power led to abuse, and they had put safeguards in place to prevent it from happening again. I stayed in the house. I did not move. I had thought about it during the worst of the conflict, but I decided I was not going to let Teresa chase me out of my own home. I had bought the house because I wanted low maintenance and stability, and I was going to keep it. The neighborhood was beautiful. The location was convenient. The HOA, now that Teresa was gone, was manageable. I could live with that. I could be happy with that. And I was. I took my RV on trips. I parked it in my driveway when I needed to. I mowed my lawn. I paid my dues. I lived my life. And no one bothered me. Looking back, the whole experience taught me a few things. First, documentation is everything. If I had not had the camera footage, the text messages, the emails, and the photos, Teresa might have won. She might have fined me, towed my RV, and filed a lien against my property. But because I had evidence, I could fight back. I could prove she was wrong. Second, allies matter. Ben's support made a difference. Linda's support made a difference. The other homeowners who spoke up made a difference. I could not have done it alone. Third, standing up to a bully is hard, but it is necessary. Teresa was counting on me to back down. She was counting on me to be intimidated. When I did not give in, she had no leverage. And finally, systems can change. The HOA was broken when Teresa was in charge, but once she was removed, the board was able to fix it. Change is possible, but it requires people to demand it. I thought about writing a letter to the board thanking them for handling the situation the way they did. I drafted it a few times but never sent it. It felt unnecessary. They had done what they were supposed to do, and I had done what I needed to do. We were even. The neighborhood moved on. Life moved on. I moved on, and that was the best outcome I could have hoped for. Not revenge, not vindication. Just peace. Just normalcy. Just the ability to live in my house without constantly looking over my shoulder. That was the real victory. The RV sat in storage most of the year. I took it out a few times for camping trips, and once for a long weekend at the coast. Every time I brought it home to load or unload, I felt a small flicker of anxiety, waiting for a violation notice that never came. Eventually, the anxiety faded. I stopped expecting the worst. I stopped checking my mailbox with dread. I stopped worrying about Teresa showing up at my door. She was gone, and she was not coming back. The board had made that clear, and even if she tried, I had the evidence, the attorney, and the support to shut her down. I was protected. I was safe. I was home. One afternoon in the spring, I was sitting on my back patio drinking coffee when my phone buzzed. It was an email from the HOA portal. For a second, my heart jumped. Then I opened it and saw it was just a notice about the annual landscaping schedule. No violation. No threat. Just routine information. I laughed at myself for the reflex. Teresa had conditioned me to fear HOA emails, but that fear did not need to exist anymore. The HOA was not my enemy. It was just a system, and now it was a system that worked fairly. I finished my coffee and went back inside. It was a normal day in a normal neighborhood. Exactly what I had wanted all along. The annual meeting the following year was quieter. There were fewer controversies, fewer complaints, fewer angry homeowners. Paula presented a budget update, Ben gave a compliance report, and Linda talked about maintenance projects. It was boring in the best possible way. No drama. No fights. No Teresa. Just people managing a neighborhood. I attended because I felt like I should, but I did not have to speak. I did not have to defend myself. I could just sit in the back and listen. When the meeting ended, I shook a few hands, thanked Ben for his work, and drove home. It was easy. It was simple. It was what community management should be. I never forgot what Teresa put me through, but I did not dwell on it. It was a chapter in my life, and it was closed. I had learned from it, grown from it, and moved past it. I had proven to myself that I could stand up to someone who tried to abuse their power, and I had won. Not because I was smarter or tougher, but because I was willing to fight for what was right. I was willing to document, to advocate, to push back, and to demand fairness. And in the end, fairness had won. The system had worked. The board had listened. Justice had been served. That was enough. That was everything. Years later, I would tell the story to friends or coworkers when the topic of HOAs came up. They would ask if I regretted buying in an HOA, and I would say no. I would say the HOA itself was not the problem. The problem was Teresa, and she was gone. The system had self-corrected. The neighborhood had improved, and I had kept my home. I had kept my peace. I had kept my sanity. That was the real story. Not the fight with Teresa, but what came after. The healing, the recovery, the return to normal. That was the part that mattered. I still live in Juniper Reserve. I still pay my dues. I still follow the rules. And the rules are fair now. They are enforced consistently. They are documented properly. They are reviewed by people who care about doing the right thing. Ben is still on the board. Paula is still the president. Linda is still the property manager. The neighborhood is stable. It is peaceful. It is what I wanted when I moved in, and I am grateful for it. Not because it was easy, but because I fought for it. Because I stood up when it would have been easier to back down. Because I demanded fairness when it would have been simpler to comply. Because I refused to let Teresa win. The RV is still in storage. I take it out a few times a year. I park it in my driveway when I need to. No one says a word. No one takes photos. No one sends violation notices. It is just a normal part of life in a normal neighborhood. And that is exactly how it should be. That is exactly what I fought for. That is exactly what I won. Not a big dramatic victory, but a quiet, sustainable peace. The ability to live my life without fear. The ability to use my own property without harassment. The ability to trust that the system will treat me fairly. That is the victory. That is the outcome. That is the end of the story. I kept the folder with all the evidence in a drawer in my office. I did not look at it often, but I knew it was there. It was a reminder that truth mattered, that documentation mattered, that standing up mattered, and that bullies, no matter how powerful they seemed, could be stopped if you were willing to fight. Teresa had seemed unstoppable at first. She controlled the portal. She controlled the process. She had the board behind her. But once I brought the evidence, once I exposed the lies, once I demanded accountability, her power evaporated. She had nothing left. And she was gone. That was the lesson. Power based on fear and manipulation is fragile. Power based on truth and fairness is strong. I chose truth. And I won. The neighborhood continued to grow and change. New families moved in. Old families moved out. The board turned over. Ben eventually stepped down, and someone else took his place. Paula retired, and a new president was elected. But the policies they had put in place remained. The transparency remained. The fairness remained. And the memory of what had happened with Teresa remained, as a warning and a lesson. No one wanted to repeat that mistake. No one wanted to give one person unchecked power again. And so the system stayed balanced. The system stayed fair. And the neighborhood stayed peaceful. I worked in cybersecurity, and I could not miss work. That was one of the things Teresa had tried to use against me. She scheduled the hearing on a weeknight when she knew I would be busy. She sent emails at odd hours hoping I would miss them. She tried to create time pressure and stress to force me into compliance. But I managed. I documented everything on my lunch breaks. I drafted emails after work. I prepared my evidence on weekends. I made it work because I had to. Because my home was at stake. Because my peace was at stake. And because I refused to let her win. That determination, that refusal to give up, was what carried me through, and it was what I would carry with me for the rest of my life. I thought about the phrase Teresa had used over and over. Read the standards. That is how it works. She said it like it was a trump card, like the standards were on her side, and I was just too ignorant to understand. But when I actually read the standards, when I actually looked at the governing documents, I found that she was wrong. The standards did not support her. The standards supported me. She had been misquoting them, twisting them, using them as a weapon instead of a guide. And when I called her out on it, when I showed the board what the standards actually said, her argument collapsed. That was the power of actually reading the rules, of actually knowing your rights, of actually understanding the system. Teresa had counted on me not doing that. She had counted on me being intimidated and uninformed. But I was not, and that made all the difference. The final board vote to dismiss the case was unanimous. Greg, Paula, and the third board member whose name I never caught all voted to void the violation, void the fines, and stop all enforcement. They also voted to tell Teresa to stop contacting me. That vote was the culmination of weeks of stress, documentation, and advocacy. It was the moment when the system finally worked the way it was supposed to. It was the moment when fairness won. And it was the moment when I knew I was safe. I could go home. I could sleep. I could live my life without fear. That vote meant everything. The outcome was exactly what I had hoped for. The board voted to dismiss the case, and Teresa was told to stop contacting me. She was eventually removed from the board entirely. The neighborhood moved on. The policies improved. And I kept my home. I kept my peace. I kept my sanity. That was the victory. Not a dramatic courtroom scene, not a public humiliation, just a quiet, decisive end to a conflict that should never have happened in the first place. Teresa had tried to abuse her power, and the system had stopped her. That was justice. That was fairness. That was the way it should always work. I learned that HOAs are not inherently bad. They can be good. They can maintain property values, enforce reasonable standards, and create a sense of community. But they require oversight. They require transparency. They require people who are willing to hold the board accountable. If no one pushes back, if no one demands fairness, then people like Teresa will take over and abuse their power. But if residents stand up, if they document the abuse, if they demand that the system work properly, then the system can self-correct. That was what happened in Juniper Reserve. The system was broken, but it was fixed. And it was fixed because people cared enough to fix it. I parked my RV in my driveway one last time before the end of the year. It was December and I was getting ready for a trip to the mountains for New Year's. I loaded my gear, checked the engine, and locked it up. No one bothered me. No one took photos. No one sent a notice. It was just another day in the neighborhood. I stood in my driveway for a moment, looking at my house, looking at the RV, looking at the quiet street. I felt a deep sense of peace. This was my home. I had fought for it. I had defended it. And I had won. That was enough. That was everything. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.